Hey guys, tonight we slip quietly into a candlelit palace corridor where the air smells faintly of beeswax, damp stone, and something unspoken, and you can almost hear the echo of a child's footsteps pacing rooms far too large for her small certainty. You're not here for the crowns and parades just yet. You're here for the ache beneath them, and honestly, you probably won't survive this emotionally intact. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And while you're settling in, drop your location and local time in the comments, because somewhere out there, someone else is listening in the dark too. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You begin as a child who does not yet know she will be Queen Victoria, only that the world feels controlled, quiet, and strangely lonely. You wake each morning under the Kensington system, a rigid set of rules devised by your mother, the Duchess of Kent, and her advisor John Conroy, who hover close enough to cast long shadows even in daylight. You are never alone, not even for a moment, and somehow that constant presence creates a deeper solitude than outright abandonment ever could. One mainstream historical fact that still anchors this story is that Victoria was raised under strict supervision, rarely allowed to play freely with other children, a method intended to keep her dependent and pliable. Historians still argue whether this overprotection was driven more by maternal fear or political ambition, but either way, it trains you early in emotional restraint. Grief, you learn, doesn't always arrive with funerals. Sometimes it arrives as absence. You lose your father, Prince Edward, Duke of Kent, before you can form memories solid enough to miss him properly. He dies when you are just 8 months old, and his absence becomes a permanent hollow in your life, like a missing stair you learn to step over without thinking. This is your first lesson in loss, that it can be invisible, normalized, almost polite. You grow up knowing he existed only through portraits, whispered references, and the way adults fall quiet when his name surfaces. A quirky tidbit historians love to mention is that Victoria later slept with a pillow said to have belonged to her father, an object that offered comfort through imagined closeness rather than lived memory. Your childhood rooms feel more like exhibits than bedrooms. Toys are permitted but supervised, laughter allowed but measured. You're taught early that your feelings are something to manage, not indulge. When your governess, Baroness Leighton, becomes your closest emotional anchor, you cling to her not just as a teacher but as a stabilizing presence in a world that never quite feels safe. This attachment, intense and exclusive, foreshadows how deeply you will bond later in life, and how devastating loss will become when it arrives again. Historians still argue whether Leighton's influence was ultimately protective or limiting, but there's little debate that she becomes your emotional refuge during formative years. You notice early how grief behaves differently in royal households. Death is acknowledged but swiftly organized, grief tucked behind velvet curtains and sealed with protocol. When relatives die, the household shifts briefly, then resumes. You're expected to absorb this rhythm without complaint. You learn that mourning has rules, that sadness must be shaped into something presentable. There's even a light joke whispered later by courtiers that royal children don't cry, they pause respectfully, which is funny in the same way a joke about weather during a hurricane is funny, technically accurate, emotionally unhelpful. The palace itself seems to echo your quiet losses. Drafts creep through corridors, clocks tick too loudly at night, and portraits watch without responding. You lie awake listening to the sounds of servants moving beyond your room, knowing life continues whether you feel ready or not. This sensory loneliness becomes familiar, almost comforting in its predictability. It's here, in these long nights, that grief begins to feel like a companion rather than an intruder. Not dramatic, not explosive, just constant. One mainstream fact often overlooked is that Victoria was emotionally precocious, keeping journals from a young age. You write not just to record events, but to process feelings you're never encouraged to speak aloud. Ink becomes a substitute for conversation. Pages absorb your frustrations, your small rebellions, your yearning for affection without conditions. Historians still argue whether these journals reveal an unusually introspective child or simply one with no other outlet, but either way, they become a lifelong tool for managing sorrow. There's a strange irony in how prepared you become for grief before you ever wear a crown. While other children scrape knees and forget by dinner, you learn to sit with discomfort. You learn patience, endurance, and how to appear composed even when unsettled inside. These traits will later be praised as regal strength, but right now they are coping mechanisms. The palace praises obedience. Your heart quietly practices survival. A fringe tidbit that circulates among biographers suggests that Victoria developed an almost superstitious sensitivity to emotional shifts, believing certain rooms carried sadness from past occupants. While there's no firm proof, it fits the pattern of a child trying to make sense of ambient sorrow in a place saturated with memory. Historians still argue whether this was childhood imagination or early emotional intelligence, but either way you begin to associate space itself with feeling, a habit that will later shape how you mourn. By the time whispers of your future role begin to reach you, grief has already shaped your inner world. You are cautious with affection, deeply loyal once attached, and quietly terrified of abandonment. You don't articulate this fear, you live it. And somewhere beneath the lessons, the rules, and the carefully staged childhood, you carry a growing unspoken understanding. Love, when it comes, will be everything, and losing it will be unbearable. You wake one morning and nothing smells the same. The air feels sharper, the silence heavier, as if the palace itself has leaned in to watch what you'll do next. At 18, you are pulled from sleep and told that your uncle, King William the Thoth, is dead, and that you are now queen. This is the moment history loves to dramatize, but what you feel first isn't triumph. It's a sudden, cold loneliness that snaps into place like a lock turning. One mainstream historical fact grounds this moment. Victoria became queen on 20th June 1837, inheriting a throne but losing, in the same breath, the last buffer between herself and absolute responsibility. Historians still argue whether her calm composure that morning was innate strength or emotional shock, freezing her in place. You are alone when you receive the news, insistently so, and that detail matters. For the first time in your life, no one is standing over you, guiding, correcting, supervising. Freedom arrives wrapped in grief, and it feels disorienting rather than liberating. You walk to a desk, sit, and begin signing documents with a hand that does not quite feel like yours. The crown settles invisibly, and already it weighs more than the heavy dresses you'll soon be required to wear. There's a joke whispered later that queens don't get a learning curve, just a learning cliff, and yes, you step straight off it. Grief shadows this transition in subtle ways. You don't mourn your uncle deeply, but his death marks the end of childhood entirely. The familiar structures of control vanish overnight, leaving you exposed rather than relieved. Your mother is still there, but now at a distance, frustrated, sidelined, no longer in command. That shift creates its own quiet sorrow, the loss of even an imperfect dependence. Historians still argue whether Victoria felt guilt over this sudden independence, but her journals hint at a complicated blend of relief and regret. Your early reign is saturated with solitude. You dine alone, attend meetings alone, and retreat at night to rooms that feel cavernous without conversation. Courtiers bow, ministers advise, but no one confides. The loneliness of authority is a different species of grief. No tears, no rituals, just an ongoing absence of equal companionship. One quirky tidbit from this period is that Victoria often talked aloud to herself while walking, rehearsing conversations she couldn't actually have, a habit servants pretended not to notice. It's endearing and unsettling at the same time, like watching someone learn to breathe underwater. Publicly, you are adored. Crowds cheer, newspapers gush about youthful promise, and artists rush to capture your image. Privately, you feel hollowed by the pace of expectation. Every gesture is watched, every mood interpreted. You learn quickly that sadness must be hidden, grief compressed into something palatable. Historians still argue whether Victoria's early confidence was genuine or performative, but the distinction matters less than the cost. Emotional isolation becomes policy. You cling fiercely to those few relationships that offer warmth. Baroness Lehzen remains close, providing continuity from childhood, though her presence sparks tension with ministers who find her influence troubling. This dynamic, needing comfort while being criticized for it, becomes a recurring pattern in your life. Grief teaches you to hold tight, and power teaches others to pry your hands open. The clash leaves bruises no one else can see. There's also the grief of what you must now suppress. Romantic fantasies, impulsive joys, even simple irritations are smoothed over in the name of stability. You are expected to embody calm permanence, a living monument, at 18. That expectation is absurd, and yet you meet it because you've been practicing restraint your entire life. One light joke circulates later that Victoria aged 10 years emotionally in her first year as queen, which sounds exaggerated until you read her exhausted journal entries and realize it might be conservative. Your nights are the hardest. Alone with your thoughts, you replay conversations, second-guess decisions, and feel the weight of a nation pressing invisibly against your chest. The palace clocks mark time relentlessly, and sleep comes in fragments. This is grief without an object, no coffin, no mourning clothes, just a sense that something irreplaceable has ended. Childhood, anonymity, safety. A fringe theory some scholars entertain is that Victoria's intense attachment style solidified during this period, shaped by the sudden vacuum of emotional support. Historians still argue whether this explains her later devotion to Albert or oversimplifies a complex personality, but the timing is hard to ignore. You are ripe for connection, desperate for someone who sees you as a person rather than a symbol. As the months pass, you grow more competent, more assured, but the loneliness does not recede. It simply becomes familiar, folded neatly into routine like a well-worn glove. You begin to understand that grief isn't always loud. Sometimes it's the steady hum beneath everything, the price of wearing a crown too soon. And though the world sees a confident young queen, you know the truth. You are still that child in oversized rooms, learning once again how to live with loss. You meet him and suddenly the air changes, like someone cracked a window in a room you didn't realize had been sealed for years. Albert arrives not as a political solution at first, but as a presence that feels oddly familiar, a person who speaks to you rather than at you. You're both young, both shaped by duty, and when he bows, it feels unnecessary. One mainstream historical fact anchors this shift. Victoria married Prince Albert of Saxe-Coburg and Gotha in 1840, and by her own admission, she fell deeply in love. Historians still argue whether it was love at first sight or a carefully nurtured attachment, but the emotional impact is undeniable. For the first time, grief loosens its grip, not because it disappears, but because it's no longer carried alone. Albert becomes a buffer between you and the relentless world, absorbing anxieties, sharing decisions, offering companionship without ceremony. You talk endlessly, sometimes urgently, as if afraid silence might take him away. There's a light joke among courtiers that the Queen had finally found someone who could keep up with her talking. And yes, it's funny because it's true. Words spill out of you now, unchecked, filling years of emotional scarcity. Marriage gives you permission to feel openly, something queens rarely get. You are affectionate, demonstrative, almost defiantly human. Letters fly back and forth when you're briefly apart, full of longing and reassurance. Albert isn't just a husband. He's your emotional infrastructure. A quirky tidbit often overlooked is how involved Albert becomes in reorganizing your daily schedule, not as control, but as care, smoothing routines to reduce your stress. Historians still argue whether this arrangement empowered or constrained Victoria, but from inside it feels like relief. Your grief doesn't vanish, it reshapes itself. Early losses and loneliness now heighten your fear of separation. You become intensely dependent on Albert's presence, needing him near to sleep soundly, to decide confidently, to feel balanced. This dependence is sometimes criticized later, but it's born of deprivation, not weakness. When you've lived so long without emotional safety, you cling when you finally find it. That's not pathology, it's adaptation. Publicly, the marriage is scrutinized. Albert's foreignness, his lack of official power, and your visible devotion raise eyebrows. Privately, you don't care. You've found refuge, and you guard it fiercely. You resent court obligations that pull you apart, bristle at criticism of his influence, and feel personally attacked when ministers question his role. One mainstream fact often noted is that Albert had no formal constitutional authority, yet he exerted significant behind-the-scenes influence, a reality that fuels debate. Historians still argue whether this influence was appropriate or excessive, but for you, it's survival. There are moments of ordinary happiness that feel almost surreal. Shared meals, private jokes, evening walks. Small things that would be unremarkable in another life become extraordinary here. You savor them with intensity, aware on some level that happiness has a shelf life. Grief has taught you that nothing is guaranteed. This awareness sharpens joy but also seeds anxiety, a constant undercurrent of what if. A fringe tidbit that fascinates biographers is Victoria's near-religious language about Albert, describing him as her angel even while alive. Some see this as romantic excess, others as an early sign of idealization that grief will later crystallize. Historians still argue whether this language reflects genuine spirituality or emotional projection, but it underscores how central he becomes to your sense of stability. You are still queen, still watched, still judged, but now you are not alone in the judgment. Decisions feel lighter when shared, criticisms easier to bear when deflected by shared humor. Albert grounds you, challenges you gently, and offers the kind of emotional constancy you've never known. The palace feels warmer, the nights quieter, sleep deeper. Grief recedes into the background, not gone but dormant. There's a subtle shift in how you imagine the future. Before Albert, it was a long corridor of duty stretching endlessly forward. With him, it gains texture, children, shared projects, growing old together. That last thought feels almost dangerous, tempting fate, and you push it aside with a nervous laugh. After all, history doesn't let queens have uncomplicated happiness. Still, for now, you allow yourself to rest, to love, to believe, cautiously, that grief might finally be something you've outrun. And if there's one thing grief does well, it's waiting patiently, unseen until you forget to look over your shoulder. You settle into happiness the way someone might settle onto thin ice, carefully, aware of every sound beneath your feet, but still hoping it will hold. Domestic life with Albert unfolds in rhythms that feel almost unreal in their gentleness. Breakfasts taken together, shared work at adjoining desks, evenings where conversation drifts into comfortable silence. One mainstream historical fact frames this period. Victoria and Albert had 9 children between 1840 and 1857, and the early years of their marriage are widely regarded as emotionally fulfilling. Historians still argue whether this domestic ideal was as harmonious as it appeared, but from inside it feels like a miracle. Motherhood adds texture to your happiness, though not uncomplicated joy. You love your children, but pregnancy exhausts you and childbirth frightens you more than you admit. You joke darkly in letters about the ordeal, humor as armor, because even happiness seems to demand endurance. There's a light joke often repeated that Victoria adored babies, but disliked pregnancy intensely, which sounds flippant until you realize how little control she had over her own body during those years. Albert becomes the axis around which everything turns. You trust him implicitly, lean on his judgment, and bristle when others suggest restraint. Your partnership deepens into something symbiotic. He organizes, rationalizes, steadies. You inspire, decide, and feel. A quirky tidbit from this time is that Albert took charge of redesigning royal estates, fussing over ventilation and sanitation with the intensity of a man trying to protect his family from invisible threats. Historians still argue whether his meticulousness bordered on obsession, but you welcome it as care. Grief hasn't disappeared. It's simply quieter. It surfaces in fleeting moments, a child's illness, Albert's brief absence, a sudden memory of your own childhood loneliness. These moments pass quickly, soothed by reassurance and routine. Yet they leave traces, small reminders that happiness is conditional. You find yourself counting blessings, mentally rehearsing gratitude, as if it might ward off loss. It's almost funny, in a sad way, like knocking on wood when the entire house is made of it. Public perception shifts during these years. You are no longer just a young queen, but a wife, a mother, a symbol of respectable domesticity. The nation projects its ideals onto your family, celebrating you as moral exemplars. Privately, this pressure feels stifling. You worry constantly about appearances, about failing at perfection. Historians still argue whether this image was empowering or constraining, but for you, it adds a new layer of anxiety. The fear of letting everyone down. There are moments of genuine laughter. Private jokes shared over dinner, teasing letters exchanged during brief separations, playful competitiveness in music or art. Albert challenges you intellectually, encourages learning, and treats you as a partner rather than an ornament. One mainstream fact often noted is Albert's role in promoting education and the arts, including the Great Exhibition of 1851. You're proud of him, fiercely so, and that pride feeds your sense of shared purpose. A fringe tidbit that occasionally surfaces is Victoria's belief that happiness itself required vigilance. She reportedly avoided expressing joy too exuberantly, fearing it might tempt fate. Historians still argue whether this reflects superstition or psychological coping, but it fits the pattern of someone shaped by early loss. You've learned that joy can vanish without warning. Even so, these years feel golden. The palace hums with life, children's voices echo down corridors, and Albert's presence anchors everything. You allow yourself to imagine a long future, cautiously, like tracing outlines rather than filling them in. Growing old together becomes a possibility you no longer immediately dismiss. And yet beneath the routines and laughter, something else stirs. Albert grows thinner, tires more easily, brushes off minor ailments with a wave of his hand. You notice, file it away, and tell yourself not to worry. After all, this is the season of happiness. Grief has had its turn, hasn't it? You convince yourself that you've earned peace. The ice holds, for now. But every quiet happiness carries the memory of what came before, and somewhere deep inside, you know that nothing this precious goes untested. You keep walking forward, careful, hopeful, and just a little afraid of the sound beneath your feet. You begin to notice the changes the way you notice a draft in a familiar room, subtle at first, easy to dismiss, but impossible to ignore once you're aware of them. Albert tires more quickly, his steps slowing just enough to register in the back of your mind. He laughs it off, insists he's fine, returns to his papers. One mainstream historical fact frames this growing unease. Prince Albert's health declined in the late 1850s and early 1860s, marked by chronic stomach issues, exhaustion, and what doctors of the time struggled to diagnose. Historians still argue whether his final illness was typhoid, Crohn's disease, or something else entirely, and that uncertainty only deepens the sense of helplessness. Denial becomes your quiet companion. You've waited too long for this happiness to surrender it easily. Every sign is rationalized, every concern postponed. You convince yourself that stress is the culprit. After all, Albert works relentlessly, shoulders responsibility without complaint. There's even a light joke you cling to, half serious, that men of genius are always a bit unwell, as if brilliance itself exacts a physical toll. Humour becomes a shield again, thin but familiar. The doctors offer reassurance without clarity. Victorian medicine is a maze of confident guesses and limited understanding, and you accept their authority because the alternative is fear. They prescribe rest, tonics, changes of scenery. Albert complies just enough to keep you calm. You watch him closely, memorizing his habits, his expressions, the way his hand feels in yours. Grief begins to creep in before loss, a preemptive ache that settles in your chest and refuses to leave. Your fear expresses itself as vigilance. You fuss over meals, schedules, and temperatures, hovering in ways you know might annoy him but can't stop. A quirky tidbit from this period is that Victoria began tracking Albert's daily routines with near-military precision, noting sleep, appetite, and mood in her journals. Historians still argue whether this behavior reflects love, anxiety, or emerging anticipatory grief, but from inside it feels like control in a situation slipping beyond it. Public life does not pause for private dread. You continue appearances, host events, manage affairs of state, all while carrying the constant hum of worry. The contrast is exhausting. One moment you're smiling beneath chandeliers, the next you're listening for his cough in the next room. This split existence sharpens your awareness of how fragile your refuge truly is. Happiness now feels brittle, as if any sudden movement might shatter it. Albert, for his part, grows more withdrawn. Whether from illness, stress, or the weight of unspoken fear, he retreats into work. You sense the distance and interpret it as a personal failing, a thought that grief encourages with cruel efficiency. Historians still argue whether Albert understood the severity of his condition, but his letters suggest a man both aware and determined to minimize its impact on you. There are nights when sleep won't come. You lie awake, listening to his breathing, counting seconds between inhales, willing them to remain steady. This is grief rehearsing itself, running through scenarios you refuse to voice aloud. You remember your father, the way absence can arrive suddenly and stay forever. The memory tightens your chest and you push it away, unwilling to let the past predict the future. A fringe theory floated by some scholars suggests that Albert's illness was exacerbated by chronic overwork and psychological stress, an early example of what we might now call burnout. Historians still argue whether this interpretation imposes modern concepts onto the past, but it resonates with what you see, a man driven by duty, ignoring his own limits. You begin to bargain internally. If he recovers, you'll be more patient, less demanding, endlessly grateful. You'll stop worrying, stop clinging, stop imagining endings. These silent promises pile up, unspoken and impossible to fulfill. Grief loves bargains because they offer the illusion of agency. As weeks turn into months, the line between hope and fear blurs. Some days he seems better, color returning to his cheeks, energy flickering back. You cling to these moments with desperate optimism. Other days he fades again and the dread rushes back, stronger for having been briefly held at bay. You don't say it out loud, not yet, but somewhere deep inside the understanding forms. This happiness, so carefully balanced, is under threat. And grief, patient and familiar, has begun its slow return, reminding you that love's greatest gift is also its greatest vulnerability. You are not prepared for how quickly everything collapses. One day, you are counting breaths, negotiating with fate in silence, and the next the room feels impossibly still. Albert dies on 14th of December 1861, and the world does not end the way you half expected it to. It simply stops. One mainstream historical fact anchors this moment. Prince Albert's death at age 42 leaves Queen Victoria devastated, plunging her into prolonged mourning. Historians still argue whether his death was sudden or the culmination of long decline, but for you, the distinction doesn't matter. He is gone, and nothing else has meaning. Shock takes over first. You move mechanically, following instructions, answering questions you don't remember being asked. Your body keeps functioning, a betrayal you resent deeply. There's a strange, hollow humor in noticing trivial details, the way curtains hang, the sound of footsteps, when the most important thing has vanished. It's the kind of moment where someone might crack a joke about time stopping, except the clocks keep ticking, and yes, you hate them for it. Grief arrives not as tears, but as disbelief. You keep expecting him to speak, to shift in bed, to argue gently about some minor detail. The absence is so loud it feels physical. You sit beside him, touching his hand, waiting for warmth that never returns. This is the grief you've been circling your entire life, the one all the earlier losses were preparing you for. Rituals descend quickly. Black cloth, hushed voices, controlled movements. The palace transforms overnight, draped in mourning. You participate without really participating, moving through ceremonies as if underwater. A quirky tidbit from this moment is that Victoria insisted on keeping Albert's rooms exactly as they were, including fresh clothes laid out daily, a practice that would continue for years. Historians still argue whether this was a coping mechanism or a sign of pathological grief, but from inside it feels like survival. You cannot bear the idea of separation, even in death. You write letters to him, speak to him aloud, cling to objects he touched, as if they might still carry him back. Sleep becomes impossible. When it comes, it's fractured by dreams where he is present till you wake and remember. This oscillation between presence and absence is torture. Grief has become immersive, total, inescapable. The nation mourns too, but at a distance. Public condolences flood in, heavy with sympathy and expectation. You cannot read them. The words feel inadequate, even offensive. How could anyone else understand this loss? Historians still argue whether Victoria's withdrawal was a personal necessity or a political failure, but in this moment, politics feels obscene. Your identity fractures. Queen, wife, mother. Only one of these feels real now, and it's the one that has just been ripped away. You refer to yourself as the Widow of Windsor, a title that erases everything else. One mainstream fact often cited is that Victoria wore black for the rest of her life, a visible declaration that this grief would not be contained by time. For you, it's not symbolism, it's truth made fabric. A fringe tidbit, some scholars note, is Victoria's fixation on Albert's death mask and handcasts, objects that allowed her to touch something that once touched him. Historians still argue whether this was morbid by Victorian standards or entirely consistent with contemporary mourning culture, but your need is simple: proof that he existed, that he was real, that he loved you. You begin to retreat from the world. Rooms close, engagements cancel, voices fade. Even your children feel distant, reminders of a life that no longer fits. This withdrawal alarms advisors and comforts you. Silence feels safer than conversation, darkness kinder than light. Grief now defines time itself. There is before and after feels endless. You cannot imagine a future that doesn't include him, and so you refuse to imagine one at all. In this stillness, this suspended moment, you become something history will later struggle to categorize, a queen who cannot move on because moving on feels like betrayal. You wake each day into the same reality, and each day it feels newly impossible. Widowhood doesn't arrive as a phase, it arrives as a permanent condition. You dress in black not as performance, but as armor, the fabric, heavy, enveloping, a physical manifestation of the weight you carry. One mainstream historical fact defines this era. After Albert's death, Victoria withdrew from public life for years, earning criticism for her near-total absence from ceremonial duties. Historians still argue whether this withdrawal endangered the monarchy or preserved her sanity, and from where you stand, the argument feels irrelevant. Grief becomes routine. You structure your days around it, building rituals that keep Albert present. His clothes are laid out each morning, his rooms aired and maintained, his memory curated with almost devotional care. There's a strange comfort in repetition, in pretending time has stalled. A light joke whispered later, unfair but persistent, is that Albert remained the most punctual man in England, arriving every day precisely on time in memory, if not in body. You would not laugh, but you understand the impulse. Your identity contracts. You stop thinking of yourself as queen first, woman second. Now you are widow before all else. The title, wife, lingers painfully, like an echo in an empty room. You sign letters with references to him, speak of him in the present tense, and bristle when others suggest adjustment. Historians still argue whether Victoria's prolonged mourning was culturally excessive, even by Victorian standards, but grief does not follow etiquette. Public patience wears thin. Newspapers grumble, politicians fret, and the nation begins to split between sympathy and frustration. You sense the shift but cannot respond. The world's demands feel cruelly trivial compared to your loss. One mainstream fact often cited is that Republican sentiment in Britain briefly increased during your withdrawal, a political consequence you register distantly, like hearing thunder far away. You find solace in isolation, but isolation sharpens grief in unexpected ways. Without distraction, memories replay endlessly. Small details, Albert's handwriting, the sound of his cough, the warmth of his presence, return with relentless clarity. Sleep remains elusive. When it comes, dreams blur past and present, until waking feels like a second bereavement. A quirky tidbit from this period is Victoria's insistence on exact mourning protocols, down to the angle of crepe on servants' uniforms. Historians still argue whether this rigidity was about control or expression, but for you, order is the only thing grief hasn't taken. If you can't control loss, you can at least control its surroundings. Your relationships shift under the strain. Children feel neglected, ministers feel shut out, and even trusted confidants struggle to reach you. You are not unkind, just unreachable. Grief has built walls, and you do not yet see a reason to dismantle them. The palace grows quieter, heavier, saturated with memory. There's a dangerous comfort in martyrdom. You begin to believe that suffering honors Albert, that easing your grief might diminish his importance. Historians still argue whether this mindset prolonged your mourning or simply reflected it, but the belief takes root firmly. You will not be hurried. You will not be consoled. Time passes anyway. Seasons change outside windows you rarely open. The world adapts to your absence, reshaping itself around a grieving queen. You remain suspended, preserved in sorrow like an insect in amber. And yet, beneath the black silk and rigid ritual, something stirs, not hope, not yet, but fatigue. Grief, this total, requires energy, and even queens have limits. You don't acknowledge it, but the stillness begins to chafe. Widowhood has become identity, refuge, and prison all at once. And somewhere in that tension the first faint crack appears. You begin to sense the watching before you fully feel the criticism. It seeps in through letters you don't open, whispers you overhear, the careful tone ministers use when they speak your name. Your grief, once unquestioned, is now a subject of debate. One mainstream historical fact anchors this shift. By the mid-1860s, Queen Victoria's prolonged absence from public duties sparked growing concern about the visibility and relevance of the monarchy. Historians still argue whether public frustration was exaggerated by the press or genuinely widespread, but the pressure is real either way. The nation mourned with you at first. Black crepe hung in shop windows, sermons were preached, and sympathy poured in. But grief has an expiration date in the public imagination, and you have exceeded it. People want a queen, not a widow. You feel this expectation like a low-grade fever, constant, irritating, impossible to ignore. There's a dark joke circulating that Britain is being ruled by a ghost, which would be funny if it didn't feel uncomfortably accurate. You resent the intrusion. How can anyone measure your loss? Albert was not a symbol to you, he was heir. The idea that his absence should be managed for political optics feels obscene. Historians still argue whether Victoria's resistance to public life was a principled stand or emotional avoidance, but from inside it feels like self-preservation. At the same time, guilt creeps in. You are aware, dimly, that your withdrawal affects more than just you. Policies stall, ceremonies are delegated, and your invisibility creates a vacuum others rush to fill. One mainstream fact often noted is that royal engagements declined dramatically during this period, shifting the monarchy's public role. You know this, and yet knowing does not translate into action. Your grief hardens under scrutiny. Criticism doesn't motivate change, it entrenches you further. You retreat deeper, convinced that the world is hostile to your pain. A quirky tidbit from this era is that Victoria sometimes read particularly harsh newspaper editorials aloud to herself, working herself into tears or anger before tearing the pages up. Historians still argue whether this habit was masochistic or cathartic, but it underscores how deeply the criticism cut. Sympathy and resentment coexist in uncomfortable proximity. Letters arrive praising your devotion even as pamphlets question your fitness to rule. You become hyper-aware of being watched, judged, interpreted. Grief, once private, now feels performative no matter what you do. If you remain hidden, you are accused of neglect. If you appear, your sorrow is scrutinized for authenticity. Your relationship with the public fractures. You no longer feel seen as a person, only as a problem. This perception feeds your isolation, reinforcing the belief that withdrawal is safer than engagement. Historians still argue whether Victoria underestimated the public's capacity for empathy or overestimated its cruelty, but the damage to trust is real. There are moments when you consider emerging, if only briefly. You imagine appearing at a ceremony, standing silently, letting the nation see your loss. But the thought exhausts you before it comforts you. Grief has narrowed your bandwidth. Even symbolic gestures feel overwhelming. A fringe theory among scholars suggests that Victoria's prolonged mourning inadvertently reshaped the monarchy, shifting power toward Parliament and away from personal rule. Historians still argue whether this was an unintended consequence or a natural evolution, but your absence creates space others occupy. You remain torn between duty and devotion, each pulling in opposite directions. To return feels like betrayal. To stay hidden feels like failure. The tension settles into your bones, a constant ache layered atop grief. And yet the watching continues. The nation waits, impatient and unsure. You are still queen, whether you feel capable of it or not. Grief may be yours alone, but its consequences ripple outward, demanding a reckoning you are not yet ready to face. You build a world where Albert never quite leaves. If you can't stop time, you can at least furnish it carefully. Letters, locks of hair, worn slippers, half-used blotting paper. Objects become anchors, proof against the terror that memory might fade. One mainstream historical fact defines this phase. Victoria preserved Albert's belongings meticulously, maintaining his rooms as if he were still alive, a practice that continued for decades. Historians still argue whether this behavior reflects Victorian mourning norms or an unusually intense attachment, but for you it's simply how you breathe. Ritual becomes your language of grief. Each morning follows a precise order, his clothes laid out, water refreshed, rooms aired. These acts are not symbolic, they are practical, necessary. You tell yourself that stopping would be the real death. There's a grim little joke you never say aloud, that as long as the routine holds, so does he. It's not funny, but grief rarely is. You surround yourself with relics, treating them with reverence usually reserved for saints. Rings are worn until the metal thins, portraits placed where your eyes will find them instinctively. A quirky tidbit scholars love to mention is your attachment to Albert's dressing gown, which you reportedly kept close enough to touch, as if fabric could substitute for flesh. Historians still argue whether such objects intensified your sorrow or softened it, but you know this much. Without them, the emptiness is unbearable. Letters become conversations. You write to Albert as if he might answer, updating him on children, politics, weather, anything to keep the dialogue alive. The act is intimate and painful, but also stabilizing. One mainstream fact often overlooked is how prolific Victoria remained as a writer during mourning, filling volumes with correspondence and journals. You are not retreating into silence, you are retreating into words. These rituals draw criticism, of course. Advisors worry, doctors murmur, family members exchange looks. You feel their concern but reject it instinctively. Grief has already taken enough. You will not let it take your methods of coping too. Historians still argue whether intervention might have shortened your mourning, but the premise offends you. Healing feels like erasure. Your children watch all this with mixed emotions. Some feel excluded, others smothered by the omnipresence of a father they cannot fully remember. You love them, but Albert's absence distorts the space between you. One light, slightly cruel joke whispered later is that Albert became the most influential parent in the household precisely because he wasn't there. You would bristle at that, but you can't entirely deny it. The palace itself becomes a museum of grief. Nothing is discarded, everything is catalogued. Visitors sense it immediately, the way air feels heavy with remembrance. A fringe theory suggests that this environment reinforced your mourning by preventing emotional distance. Historians still argue whether surroundings shape grief or merely reflect it, but you know how different the rooms feel now, less alive, more reverent. At night, you move among these objects quietly, touching, remembering, rehearsing conversations that no longer progress. Grief loops inward, feeding itself. Yet within this closed system you find stability. The outside world may judge, but inside these rituals there is order, continuity, and a strange peace. You are aware, faintly, that this cannot last forever. Objects decay, paper yellows, fabric frays. Even relics are mortal. The thought terrifies you, and you push it away, returning to routine with renewed intensity. As long as the rituals hold, so does the illusion that love can outlast death in tangible form. And so you remain here, surrounded by letters, relics, and habits that keep Albert near. The world calls it obsession, you call it fidelity. Grief has narrowed your universe, but within its boundaries, you are still with him, and for now, that is enough. You begin to realize that grief doesn't just occupy space, it rearranges relationships. Your children grow up in the long shadow of Albert's absence, and you, unintentionally, keep that shadow carefully intact. One mainstream historical fact frames this dynamic. Queen Victoria's relationships with her children were often strained, marked by emotional distance and intense control, particularly after Albert's death. Historians still argue whether her parenting style stemmed from grief, temperament, or the pressures of monarchy, but the emotional weather inside the family is unmistakable. You love your children fiercely and anxiously, but love arrives tangled with fear. Every illness feels like a threat, every independence like a risk. You hover, criticize, instruct, correct. Grief sharpens your need for control, convincing you that vigilance equals protection. There's a light, uncomfortable joke later historians make that Victoria expected her children to behave like miniature adults because childhood had never felt safe to her. It stings because it's partly true. Albert remains the standard by which everything is measured. You invoke him constantly, comparing children to their father, praising or chastising them through his imagined gaze. For some, this becomes motivating, for others, suffocating. Historians still argue whether this constant comparison honored Albert or burdened the children with an impossible legacy. But inside the household, tension simmers. Your daughters feel your scrutiny acutely. You monitor their marriages, their bodies, their emotions, projecting your own fears onto their futures. You warn them about pregnancy, about men, about loss, sometimes with an intensity that borders on alarmist. A quirky tidbit often cited is Victoria's frank, almost grim descriptions of childbirth in letters to her daughters, intended as caution, but often received as dread. Grief, it seems, wants company. Your sons fare no easier. You worry they will never measure up to Albert, that they will disappoint or endanger themselves. You oscillate between indulgence and sharp criticism, unsure which will keep them safe. One mainstream fact often discussed is Victoria's particularly fraught relationship with her eldest son Bertie, later Edward VII. Historians still argue whether her harsh judgment contributed to his insecurities or simply reflected their clashing personalities. Family gatherings feel tense, charged with unspoken expectations. You want closeness but don't quite know how to achieve it without control. Grief has eroded your ability to tolerate emotional risk even with your own children. It's safer to instruct than to listen, safer to supervise than to trust. A fringe theory some scholars propose is that Victoria unconsciously positioned herself as both parents, refusing to relinquish Albert's role while also struggling under its weight. Historians still argue whether this dual role intensified her exhaustion, but you feel perpetually overburdened, emotionally and mentally. The children respond in different ways. Some withdraw, some rebel, some comply outwardly, while nursing private resentment. You notice these shifts but interpret them through the lens of fear rather than empathy. Grief distorts perception, convincing you that firmness is love's truest form. And yet there are moments, brief, surprising, when connection breaks through. A shared laugh, a quiet conversation, a sense of pride that catches you off guard. These moments hurt almost as much as they heal, reminders of what might have been different. You carry on mothering under the influence of loss, doing your best with the tools grief has left you. History will judge your parenting harshly at times, sympathetically at others. But inside these relationships, the truth is simpler and sadder. You are still trying to protect everyone from the pain you could not escape yourself. You don't intend for it to happen. That's the thing history often misses. John Brown does not arrive as a scandal. He arrives as practicality. He is there because someone must be, because someone has to walk beside you when grief has hollowed you out too thoroughly to stand alone. One mainstream historical fact grounds this uneasy chapter. John Brown, a Scottish servant and former gillie to Prince Albert, became a close personal attendant to Queen Victoria after Albert's death. Historians still argue whether his role was purely loyal service or something emotionally deeper, but his presence is undeniable. Brown is unlike the courtiers you've learned to distrust. He is blunt, informal, unconcerned with Polish. Where others tiptoe around your grief, he acknowledges it without ceremony. He speaks to you plainly, even sharply at times, and instead of recoiling, you feel steadied. There's a strange comfort in being treated like a person again, rather than a relic. Someone later jokes that Brown had the dangerous habit of telling the Queen the truth, which sounds humorous until you realize how rare that had become. Grief responds to him in an unexpected way, not by easing exactly, but by shifting. You still ache for Albert, still structure your days around loss, but the constant, suffocating silence lifts slightly. Brown walks with you, rides with you, talks with you. The physical presence matters more than the conversation. After years of absence, a human figure beside you feels radical. The court reacts immediately, and badly, whispers harden into rumours. His informality is seen as insolence, his closeness as impropriety. Pamphlets circulate, jokes grow cruel, and your name becomes tangled in insinuation. Historians still argue whether any romantic element existed at all, but the intensity of the backlash reveals something else. How uncomfortable people are with a grieving woman finding support outside acceptable boundaries. You are furious, not because the rumours wound you, though they do, but because they threaten the one thing that has made survival possible. You dig in, defend Brown fiercely, and in doing so, deepen the controversy. A quirky tidbit from this period is your insistence on awarding Brown medals and honours, gestures that scandalise the court but feel necessary to you. Historians still argue whether these actions were defiant gratitude or emotional overinvestment, but to you they are justice. Brown himself is not gentle. He scolds you when you withdraw too far, pushes you outdoors when you would rather remain shut away, and refuses to indulge complete retreat. In a strange way, this feels like loyalty to Albert as much as to you. There's a darkly funny aside later that Brown was the only man alive who could tell the Queen to get on a horse and be obeyed, which is ridiculous and entirely true. Your grief does not transform into romance. It transforms into endurance. Brown becomes a tether to the world, not a replacement for what you lost. The distinction matters deeply to you, even if it is lost on observers. Historians still argue whether emotional dependency itself constituted scandal, but grief rarely fits clean categories. The cost, however, is isolation from everyone else. Advisors withdraw, family distances itself, and court life grows colder. You choose Brown anyway, not out of rebellion, but necessity. Without him, the silence threatens to swallow you whole. When he eventually dies, the loss hits differently, sharply, but not shatteringly. It confirms something you already know. Grief doesn't end, it accumulates. Each loss layers onto the last, changing its shape but never erasing it. History will remember John Brown as a controversy, a footnote, a rumour. You remember him as the man who helped you breathe again when breathing felt optional. And in the long catalogue of your grief, that matters more than propriety ever could. You don't wake up one day and decide that grief will become policy, but slowly, quietly, it does. Mourning seeps into governance the way damp seeps into stone. Gradual, structural, impossible to ignore once it's set. One mainstream historical fact frames this evolution. During Victoria's prolonged mourning, the practical power of governance continued shifting toward Parliament and her ministers, subtly redefining the monarchy's role. Historians still argue whether this shift was accelerated by her withdrawal or would have happened regardless. But your grief undeniably leaves fingerprints on the state. You begin to rule from a distance, physically and emotionally. Boxes of documents replace faces, correspondence substitutes for conversation. You sign, approve, comment, often perceptively but without presence. There's a dry joke among officials that the Queen governs by pen and ink rather than crown and carriage, which would amuse you if it didn't feel uncomfortably accurate. Grief has narrowed the ways you can engage, but it hasn't erased your intelligence. Public appearances become symbolic rather than relational. When you do emerge, dressed in black and silence, the effect is profound. You don't smile, don't linger, don't soften the image. The nation reads meaning into this restraint, interpreting it as dignity, stubbornness, or neglect, depending on perspective. Historians still argue whether Victoria consciously used mourning as moral authority, but you know you're simply being honest. Anything else would feel like theatre. Your personal loss begins shaping national mood. Mourning becomes fashionable, even prescriptive. Black clothing, sombre rituals, restrained emotion, these ripple outward from the palace into society. One mainstream fact often noted is that Victorian mourning customs became increasingly elaborate during your reign, influenced heavily by your example. You never intended to set trends, you were just trying to survive. Grief, it turns out, is contagious. A quirky tidbit from this era is your intense interest in memorials and monuments, approving designs and placements with unusual attention. Statues of Albert multiply, not just as tributes, but as anchors, fixed points in a world that feels unstable. Historians still argue whether this monumentalization preserved memory or froze you in sorrow, but to you, permanence feels comforting. Politically, your withdrawal creates space others eagerly fill. Prime ministers rise and fall, debates rage, reforms pass. You observe from afar, intervening selectively, often decisively, but without warmth. The monarchy becomes less personal, more abstract. A fringe theory suggests that your grief inadvertently modernized the institution, stripping it of intimacy and forcing it into constitutional clarity. Historians still argue whether this was progress or loss, but the transformation is undeniable. You are aware, faintly, that grief has become part of your authority. The image of the mourning queen carries moral weight, a reminder of duty, sacrifice, endurance. Some admire it deeply, others resent it. You accept both reactions with equal detachment. Approval no longer motivates you the way fidelity to memory does. There are moments when you wonder what Albert would think. Would he approve of this distant monarchy, this quiet reshaping of power? The question lingers without answer. You continue anyway, guided by instinct rather than certainty. Grief has altered not just who you are, but how the nation functions. You did not choose this role, but you inhabit it fully. In doing so, you leave a legacy no less powerful for being born of loss, a monarchy forever changed by one woman's refusal to pretend that love ends neatly. You grow older inside your grief before you grow old in years, and then one day the mirror catches up. The black dresses still hang the same way, but the face above them has softened, lined, settled. One mainstream historical fact frames this long stretch. Victoria reigned for more than 63 years, and in her later decades she gradually resumed more public duties, though never abandoning mourning. Historians still argue whether this return signaled healing or mere adaptation, but from where you stand it feels like endurance rather than recovery. Grief no longer burns, it aches. It becomes a low, constant pressure, like weather in the joints. You don't wake each day shattered anymore, but neither do you wake free. Albert's absence is no longer shocking, it is foundational. You have lived longer without him than with him now, a realization that lands heavily when you allow yourself to think it. There's a bleak little joke you might almost make, if humour still came easily, that you've been a widow longer than you were a wife, which feels unfair in a universe already stacked against you. Your routines persist, though softened by time. Some rituals loosen, others remain stubbornly intact. His rooms are still preserved, though entered less often. Letters are reread rather than written. You speak of Albert less constantly, but never less intensely. Historians still argue whether this shift represents emotional processing or simple fatigue, but grief has learned to coexist with the rest of your life rather than dominate every moment. Physically, age makes itself known. You move more slowly, tire more easily, and rely increasingly on familiar comforts. Yet your mind remains sharp, opinions strong, temper occasionally flaring. One mainstream fact often noted is that Victoria became more outspoken in her later years, less inclined to soften her views for politeness. Grief, having stripped away the need to please, leaves you blunt and unapologetic. Your isolation eases slightly, not through renewed intimacy, but through habit. Public appearances feel less threatening now that expectations have adjusted. The nation has grown used to you as you are. You are no longer the grieving young widow or the controversial recluse. You are the old queen, formidable and fixed. Historians still argue whether this familiarity restored affection or merely acceptance, but the hostility fades. A quirky tidbit from this period is your fondness for simple pleasures, tea, pets, routine conversations, that contrast sharply with your monumental image. You find comfort in repetition, in predictability, perhaps because grief taught you how quickly everything else can vanish. There's something quietly funny about the most powerful woman in the empire taking deep satisfaction in a well-timed cup of tea, and you would almost appreciate the irony. You think about death more openly now, not with fear, but with planning. The idea of reunion with Albert brings a strange calm. Some scholars suggest that this belief sustained you through aging. Historians still argue whether it was faith or longing, but to you, the distinction barely matters. Grief has shaped you, weathered you, stripped and refined you. It no longer defines every hour, but it defines the arc of your life. You carry it the way one carries history itself, heavy, unavoidable, and strangely familiar. You are still queen. You are still widow. And now you are something else too. A woman who has survived loss so completely that survival itself becomes a quiet, radical act. You begin arranging the end the way you arranged everything else after Albert. Carefully, deliberately, with him always in mind. Death no longer feels abstract, it feels logistical. One mainstream historical fact frames this quiet preparation. In her later years, Queen Victoria gave detailed instructions for her funeral, specifying clothing, objects, and symbols that would accompany her into death. Historians still argue whether this meticulous planning reflected peace or fixation, but to you it feels like continuity. You are not preparing to leave him, you are preparing to join him. The lists are precise. What you will wear, what will lie beside you, what must not be forgotten. You insist on Albert's dressing gown, a lock of his hair, the plaster cast of his hand. These are not morbid tokens, they are familiar anchors, the same way his clothes once laid out daily anchored your mornings. There's a soft, almost wry humour in realizing that even in death, you are still organizing your grief. Some habits don't break. They simply follow you. You think often now of the moment after, of what, if anything, comes next. The idea of reunion steadies you. It is less theology than certainty, a conviction shaped by decades of longing. Historians still argue whether Victoria's faith deepened or narrowed in widowhood, but your belief feels intensely personal rather than doctrinal. Heaven is not an abstraction, it is Albert waiting. Your body reminds you daily that time has done its work. Movement takes effort, pain arrives uninvited, and fatigue settles quickly. You accept these changes with surprising calm. Loss has already taken so much that aging feels almost negotiable by comparison. One light joke, dark but accurate, floats through your mind. After surviving that kind of grief, what's a few aching joints? You don't laugh, but the thought lands gently. Public life continues at a measured distance. Jubilees are celebrated, crowds cheer, and the empire marks milestones that feel strangely disconnected from your inner world. You appear when required, receive applause with practiced composure, and retreat again. Historians still argue whether these later appearances were acts of duty or endurance, but to you they are simply the last obligations of a long contract. Albert's presence never fades from these preparations. You imagine telling him about the plans, explaining each choice as if he were still listening. This imagined conversation comforts you. It feels less like denial now and more like habit, one you have earned through decades of absence. Grief has mellowed into companionship, quiet and constant. A quirky tidbit historians sometimes note is your insistence that your funeral be private, not the grand spectacle many expected. You want intimacy, not pageantry. This preference surprises some, given your imperial stature, but it aligns perfectly with the woman you have been since 1861. Love, not display, has always been the axis around which your world turns. You also think about how you will be remembered. Not in detail, vanity no longer motivates you, but in essence. You know history will fixate on the black dresses, the long reign, the empire at its height. Historians still argue whether your grief overshadowed your achievements or deepened them, but you sense that the private woman will be harder to see. That thought stings faintly, then fades. You have lived your truth. Remembrance is out of your hands. There is a gentleness now in how you hold memory. It no longer cuts sharply, it rests. Albert is no longer only the man you lost, but the life you had, the person who shaped everything that followed. You realize with quiet clarity that your grief has not just been about loss, it has been about loyalty. You never replaced him because you never needed to. Love did not expire, it transformed. As plans finalize and days shorten, a calm settles in. Not happiness, not relief, but readiness. You are tired in the way someone is tired after a very long watch, knowing dawn will come, whether or not you stay awake. Death feels less like an ending than a handover, a return. You are still queen, still widow, but now you are also something gentler, a woman preparing to rest, carrying with her the one thing grief never managed to take away, the certainty that she loved deeply and was loved in return. You arrive at the end the way you arrived at everything after Albert, quietly, without spectacle inside yourself, even as the world gathers outside. Your body is frail now, breath thinner, movements measured, but your inner world feels oddly complete. One mainstream historical fact closes the arc. Queen Victoria dies on 22nd January 1901, ending the longest reign Britain had ever known at that time. Historians still argue whether the nation mourned her as a beloved matriarch or a distant monument, but from inside her final days, None of that matters. What matters is that the long watch is over. You think, not for the first time, about how strange memory is. The world remembers you in black, immovable, eternal. It remembers the empire, the jubilees, the stern face on coins. What it rarely remembers is the woman who spent decades waking each morning already missing someone. Grief becomes your most faithful companion, present longer than joy, longer than youth, longer even than power. And yet, it does not destroy you, it reshapes you. You understand now that grief was never something to overcome. It was something to live with, to carry, to fold into identity until it no longer cut quite so sharply. Historians still argue whether Victoria's refusal to move on was unhealthy or heroic, but those words feel irrelevant. You did not cling to grief, you honored love. There is a difference, even if history struggles to name it. Your final thoughts drift not to crowns or critics, but to small things, shared walks, familiar handwriting, the weight of Albert's hand in yours. A quirky tidbit sometimes noted is that even near death, Victoria asked for objects connected to him to be nearby, a consistency so unwavering it borders on poetic. Historians still argue whether this constancy defined her greatness or limited it. But you know the truth. Fidelity was never weakness. As the end nears, there is no fear. Only tiredness and a quiet certainty that the long separation is finished. Grief loosens, not because it disappears, but because its work is done. You have remembered. You have endured. You have loved without replacement. History will condense you into symbols, but this story remembers something else, the private ache beneath the public permanence. The woman who ruled an empire while carrying an absence no one else could see. The queen whose grief was not forgotten by her, even if it was forgotten by history. Now the pacing slows, the noise fades, the rooms grow dimmer, softer, kinder. Your breathing evens out, thoughts lengthen, edges blur. Nothing demands anything from you anymore. You are allowed at last to rest. And so, as the final images soften and the long vigil ends, you let go, not of love, but of effort. The night closes gently around you, familiar and quiet, like a well-worn room at last grown warm. Now dim the lights in your own space, feel the weight of the day finally lift, and let your thoughts drift without urgency. You are safe here. Nothing more is required.
Sleep can come when it's ready.